Welcome to a story that will shake you to your core. What happens when a man's spirit refuses to be broken, even when his body bears the scars of countless beatings? What transforms pain into an unstoppable force? Today, I'll tell you the extraordinary tale of Kwan, a man who turned his suffering into the very power that would shatter his chains forever. If stories of human resilience and triumph move you, hit that subscribe button now, because this journey will change how you see strength itself. The Louisiana sun beat down mercilessly on Magnolia Plantation in the summer of 1858, its rays turning the cotton fields into a shimmering hell of heat and humidity. The air hung thick with the scent of sweat, earth, and fear, a combination that had become as familiar as breathing to those who worked these cursed acres. Kwan wiped the salt from his eyes with the back of his massive forearm, his dark skin glistening like polished obsidian under the relentless heat. At 28, he stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, his frame carved from years of backbreaking labor into something that seemed more sculpture than man. His hands, scarred and calloused, moved with practiced efficiency through the cotton bolls, each motion a testament to 15 years of forced expertise. But it wasn't just his size that set Kwan apart from the other enslaved workers. It was something deeper, a quality in his eyes that spoke of an unbroken spirit, a flame that no amount of cruelty had managed to extinguish. "Boy!" The voice cracked across the field like a whip, causing several workers to flinch instinctively. "You think this is a Sunday picnic?" Overseer Marcus Hargrove rode his horse slowly between the rows. His pale face flushed red from the heat and perpetual anger. A man of average height but considerable cruelty, Hargrove had earned his reputation through 15 years of systematic brutality. His leather whip hung coiled at his side like a sleeping serpent, ready to strike at the slightest provocation. Kwan didn't look up from his work, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had learned long ago that eye contact with Hargrove was an invitation for violence. "I'm talking to you, boy." Hargrove's voice rose and his horse danced nervously beneath him. "Look at me when I'm speaking." Slowly, deliberately, Kwan raised his head. His dark eyes met Hargrove's pale blue ones without flinching, without the submissive, downcast gaze the overseer expected. In that moment, something electric passed between them, a challenge unspoken but clearly understood. "That's better," Hargrove sneered, though his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "Now, you want to explain to me why your row is behind the others?" Kwan's voice, when it came, was deep and measured. "My row isn't behind, sir. It's ahead." A dangerous silence fell over the nearby workers. Even the cicadas seemed to pause their endless chorus. Hargrove's face darkened like a storm cloud gathering strength. "What did you say to me?" "I said my row is ahead, sir." Kwan's tone remained respectful, but firm. "You can count the baskets if you'd like." Hargrove's eyes flicked to the cotton baskets lined up at the end of each row. Indeed, Kwan's section showed more filled containers than any other. The overseer's face flushed deeper red, the color of rage and humiliation combined. "You calling me a liar, boy?" "No, sir, just stating facts." The whip was in Hargrove's hand before anyone could blink. Uncoiling like a striking snake, it whistled through the air and caught Kwan across the shoulder, tearing through his thin cotton shirt and opening a line of blood across his dark skin. Kwan didn't cry out. He didn't even step back. He simply stood there, his eyes never leaving Hargrove's face, as blood began to seep through the torn fabric. "Facts?" Hargrove's voice was barely controlled fury. "The only fact here is that you're property, boy. My property. And property doesn't talk back." The whip struck again, this time across Kwan's chest, then again across his back as he finally turned away. Each blow was delivered with the precision of long practice, designed to cause maximum pain without permanently damaging valuable property. But with each strike, something strange happened. Instead of breaking down, instead of begging for mercy as Hargrove expected, Kwan seemed to grow more solid, more present. His breathing remained steady, his posture straight. It was as if he was absorbing the pain and transforming it into something else entirely. "Please, Massa Hargrove," came a trembling voice from nearby. Old Samuel, a greying man who had worked these fields for 40 years, stepped forward with his hat in his hands. "Kwan didn't mean no disrespect. He just works hard, is all." Hargrove's attention snapped to the older man like a predator sensing new prey. "Did I ask for your opinion, Samuel?" "No, sir, but—" The whip caught Samuel across the face, sending him stumbling backward into the cotton plants. Blood flowed from a gash across his cheek, and he pressed his hand to the wound with a soft whimper. That's when something shifted in Kwan's eyes. The careful control he had maintained began to crack, revealing something dangerous underneath. His massive hands slowly clenched into fists. "Leave him alone," Kwan said quietly. Hargrove turned back to him, a cruel smile playing at his lips. "What was that?" "I said leave him alone." Kwan's voice was still quiet, but it carried the weight of distant thunder. "Your quarrel is with me." "My quarrel?" Hargrove laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Boy, you don't seem to understand your situation. I don't have quarrels with livestock. I have discipline problems that need correcting." The overseer dismounted from his horse with deliberate slowness, his boots hitting the ground with soft thuds. He walked toward Kwan with the confidence of a man who had never faced real resistance, his whip trailing behind him in the dust. "You want to protect old Samuel." Hargrove's voice was silk over steel. "Then you can take his punishment too." What followed was a beating that would have broken most men. Hargrove wielded his whip with the skill of a master craftsman, each stroke calculated to inflict maximum agony. The leather cut through Kwan's shirt, then his skin, painting red lines across his back, chest, and arms. But Kwan didn't fall. He didn't beg. He stood there like a mountain weathering a storm, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the plantation, beyond the pain, beyond the moment itself. With each strike, he seemed to retreat deeper into himself, to a place where Hargrove's whip couldn't reach. It was a technique he had developed as a child, a way of transforming suffering into strength, of taking the worst that could be done to him and making it fuel for something greater. The other workers watched in horrified fascination. They had seen beatings before, too many to count, but never like this. Never someone who seemed to grow stronger with each blow, who stood taller as the punishment continued. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Hargrove stepped back, breathing heavily. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his arm aching from the repeated strikes. Kwan's back was a map of red welts and flowing blood, but he still stood upright. "Get back to work," Hargrove panted, coiling his whip with shaking hands. "All of you, and remember what happens to those who forget their place." As the overseer mounted his horse and rode away, the workers slowly returned to their tasks, stealing glances at Kwan as he bent to pick up his cotton sack. Blood seeped through his torn shirt, but his movements were steady, purposeful. Old Samuel approached him cautiously, his own wound still bleeding. "Kwan, you shouldn't have—" "It's all right, Samuel," Kwan said softly, his voice carrying no trace of the pain he must have been feeling. "It's all right." But as he returned to picking cotton, his dark eyes held a new intensity, a burning that hadn't been there before. The beating had been meant to break him, to remind him of his place in the world's cruel order. Instead, it had awakened something that had been sleeping deep within him. That night, in the cramped quarters where the enslaved workers lived, Kwan sat on his narrow cot as Sarah, a woman skilled in healing, tended to his wounds. Her gentle hands cleaned the cuts with water and applied poultices made from herbs she grew in secret behind the quarters. "This is bad, Kwan," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the soft conversations and snores of the other workers. "Hargrove's never beaten anyone this bad, and let them live." Kwan winced as she cleaned a particularly deep cut, but his voice remained steady. "He's testing me." "Testing you for what?" "To see if I'll break." Kwan's eyes stared at the rough wooden ceiling above them. "To see if he can make me into what he thinks I should be." Sarah paused in her ministrations, her dark eyes searching his face. "And will you? Break, I mean?" Kwan was quiet for a long moment, listening to the night sounds filtering through the thin walls, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of wind through the trees, the soft breathing of people who had learned to find rest even in the midst of suffering. "No," he said finally, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised even him. "I won't break, not for him, not for anyone." As Sarah finished bandaging his wounds, Kwan closed his eyes and let his mind wander to the stories his grandmother had told him as a child before she was sold away to another plantation. Stories of warriors from across the ocean, men and women who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious through sheer force of will. "Strength isn't about the size of your muscles," she had whispered to him in the darkness of their shared cabin. "It's about the size of your spirit, and your spirit, child, is bigger than any chain they could ever forge." Now, lying on his cot with his back on fire from Hargrove's whip, Kwan began to understand what she had meant. The pain wasn't his enemy, it was his teacher. Each scar was a lesson in endurance, each beating a step toward something greater. He didn't know what that something was yet, but he could feel it growing inside him like a seed in fertile soil, and he knew, with the certainty of sunrise, that Marcus Hargrove had made a terrible mistake today. He had tried to break Kwan's spirit, but instead he had forged it into something unbreakable. 3 months had passed since the beating that should have broken Kwan's spirit, but instead had only strengthened his resolve. The scars on his back had healed into raised lines that told the story of his defiance. And something had changed in the atmosphere of Magnolia Plantation. It started small, almost imperceptibly. Workers began to stand a little straighter when Hargrove rode by. Conversations that once died instantly at the overseer's approach now continued in hushed whispers. Most telling of all, productivity had actually increased, as if the enslaved people were drawing strength from Kwan's example. Hargrove noticed. How could he not? The man who had built his reputation on fear and absolute control was watching that control slip away like sand through his fingers, and it was all because of one man who refused to be broken. The morning of October 15th dawned grey and oppressive, with heavy clouds hanging low over the plantation like a suffocating blanket. The air itself seemed to pulse with tension, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Kwan was in the blacksmith shop, a privilege he had earned through his skill with metalwork, one of the few tasks on the plantation that required both strength and intelligence. The forge glowed like a captured piece of the sun, and the rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil provided a steady counterpoint to his thoughts. He was shaping a horseshoe when he heard the commotion outside. Voices raised in alarm, the sound of running feet, and underneath it all, a woman's desperate crying. Setting down his hammer, Kwan stepped outside to see a crowd gathered near the main house. At its center stood Hargrove, his face flushed with rage, holding a piece of paper in his trembling hand. Beside him, Master Beauregard, the plantation owner, looked on with the detached interest of a man watching an ant farm. "Where is she?" Hargrove's voice carried across the yard like a gunshot. "Where is the girl?" The crowd parted, and Kwan saw what had caused the disturbance. Lily, a 16-year-old girl who worked in the main house, was missing. Her mother, Ruth, knelt in the dirt before Hargrove, tears streaming down her face as she clutched at his boots. "Please, Massa Hargrove," Ruth sobbed. "I don't know where she is. She was in her bed last night, I swear it. Please don't hurt her when you find her." Hargrove kicked her away with casual cruelty, sending the woman sprawling in the dust. "Don't hurt her?" He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "That girl has cost me a night's sleep and half a morning's work. When I find her, she'll wish she'd never been born." The paper in his hand was a runaway notice, Kwan realized. Lily had done what so many dreamed of, but few dared attempt. She had run for freedom. "Now," Hargrove continued, his pale eyes scanning the crowd, "I know one of you helped her. Nobody runs from Magnolia Plantation without help. So I'm going to ask once, and only once, who helped the girl escape?" Silence. The kind of absolute quiet that comes when an entire group of people collectively holds its breath. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Hargrove's smile was the expression of a predator who had cornered its prey. "No volunteers? Well, that's fine. I have ways of loosening tongues." And now he gestured to two of his assistants, brutal men who served as his enforcers when the whip wasn't enough. They grabbed old Samuel, the same man Kwan had tried to protect months earlier, and dragged him forward. "Samuel here is going to help me demonstrate what happens to communities that harbor runaways," Hargrove announced. "Maybe after he's had some time to think about it. Someone's memory will improve." The enforcers forced Samuel to his knees and began tying his hands to a wooden post that had been erected for just such purposes. The old man's eyes found Kwan's across the crowd, and in them Kwan saw not fear, but resignation. Samuel knew he was about to die for something he hadn't done, and he had accepted it with the weary grace of a man who had seen too much cruelty to be surprised by more. "Wait." The voice that cut through the morning air was deep and calm, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Every head turned toward its source, and Hargrove's face went white as he saw Kwan step forward from the crowd. "I helped her." The lie came easily, smoothly, without a trace of hesitation. Kwan had no idea who had actually helped Lily escape, if anyone had. But he knew with crystal clarity that he couldn't stand by and watch an innocent man die for a crime he hadn't committed. Hargrove's eyes narrowed to slits. "You?" "Yes, sir. I gave her directions to the river and told her which roads to avoid." Kwan's voice remained steady, matter of fact, as if he were discussing the weather. "Samuel had nothing to do with it." A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. Some faces showed admiration, others horror at what they knew was coming. Ruth looked up from where she knelt in the dirt, her tear-stained face a mask of gratitude and terror. Hargrove studied Kwan for a long moment, his pale eyes searching for any sign of deception. But Kwan's face was an unreadable mask, his dark eyes meeting the overseer's gaze without flinching. "Untie Samuel," Hargrove said finally, never taking his eyes off Kwan. "It seems we have our real culprit." As the enforcers released the old man, Hargrove walked slowly toward Kwan, his boots crunching on the gravel with each deliberate step. When he was close enough that only Kwan could hear him, he leaned in and whispered, "You think you're clever, don't you? Playing the hero. But I know you're lying. The question is, why would you lie to protect a runaway you've never even spoken to?" Kwan's response was equally quiet, but it carried the force of an avalanche, "Because someone has to." Hargrove's face went through several shades of red before settling on a deep purple that suggested apoplexy. "Chain him to the post," he ordered his men, "and bring me the cat-o'-nine-tails." The cat-o'-nine-tails was Hargrove's special instrument of torture, a whip with 9 separate leather thongs, each tipped with small metal barbs designed to tear flesh with every stroke. It was reserved for the most serious offenses, and few men survived more than a dozen lashes. As the enforcers chained Kwan's wrists to the wooden post, he caught sight of faces in the crowd. Sarah, the healer, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Young Marcus, barely 14, watching with the wide-eyed fascination of someone seeing true courage for the first time. Old Samuel, free now, but bearing the weight of knowing another man was taking his place. And in the back, almost hidden behind the others, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. A flash of brown skin and bright eyes, there for just a moment before disappearing again. Lily. The girl was still here, still on the plantation, hidden somewhere safe. His lie had been the truth after all, in a way. By claiming responsibility for her escape, he had given her the perfect cover to remain hidden. No one would look for a girl who had supposedly already fled. The first stroke of the cat-o'-nine-tails felt like being struck by lightning. The 9 thongs spread across his back like grasping fingers, each barb tearing through skin and muscle with surgical precision. Kwan's body jerked against the chains, but no sound escaped his lips. "That's one," Hargrove announced to the crowd. "Let's see how long our hero lasts." The second stroke crossed the first, creating a pattern of agony across Kwan's shoulders. Blood began to flow freely, staining his torn shirt and dripping onto the ground below. Still, he made no sound. By the 5th stroke, the crowd had begun to murmur uneasily. They had seen beatings before, but never like this. Never someone who absorbed such punishment without crying out, without begging for mercy. By the 10th stroke, even Hargrove's enforcers were looking uncomfortable. Kwan's back was a ruin of torn flesh and flowing blood, but he remained upright, his breathing steady, his silence absolute. "Scream, damn you!" Hargrove snarled, raising the whip for the 11th stroke. "Give me something!" But Kwan had retreated to that place deep inside himself, the sanctuary his grandmother had taught him to find. In that place, there was no pain, no fear, no Marcus Hargrove. There was only the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and the unshakable knowledge that he was doing what was right. The 11th stroke fell. Then the 12th, the 13th. It was after the 15th stroke that something extraordinary happened. As Hargrove raised the whip for what he intended to be the killing blow, a voice rose from the crowd. "Enough!" It was Sarah, the healer, stepping forward with her chin raised and her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "You'll kill him, and then what? Who's going to work the forge? Who's going to shoe the horses and mend the tools?" Hargrove turned toward her, his face a mask of rage. "Get back, woman, Before you what?" Another voice joined Sarah's. This time it was Marcus, the 14-year-old boy, his young voice cracking with emotion, but strong with conviction. "Before you beat all of us, who's going to work your fields then?" One by one, other voices joined the chorus. Not in open rebellion, they weren't ready for that yet, but in a quiet, steady resistance that was perhaps even more powerful. "The boy's right," said Thomas, a man who worked the cotton gin. "Kwan's the best blacksmith we've had. Killing him would be wasteful." "Wasteful," echoed another voice, and another. Hargrove looked around at the faces surrounding him, and for the first time in his career as an overseer, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. He saw a group of people who were no longer afraid of him. Oh, they still feared the whip, still feared the consequences of open defiance, but they were no longer afraid of him as a person, and that, he realized, was the beginning of the end of his power. "Cut him down," he said finally, his voice hoarse with frustrated rage. "Get him to the quarters and patch him up. But mark my words, all of you, this isn't over, not by a long shot." As the enforcers unchained Kwan from the post, he collapsed to his knees, his strength finally giving out. But even as Sarah and the others rushed to support him, even as blood continued to flow from the ruins of his back, his eyes remained clear and focused. He had won something today. Not the battle, that was still to come. But he had won something more important. He had shown everyone on the plantation, including himself, that Marcus Hargrove was not invincible, and sometimes that's all it takes to start a revolution. That night, as Sarah tended to wounds that should have killed him, Kwan lay on his cot and listened to the whispered conversations around him. The other workers spoke in hushed, awed tones about what they had witnessed, about the man who had taken 15 lashes from the cat-o'-nine-tails and lived to tell about it. But Kwan wasn't thinking about his survival. He was thinking about the look in Hargrove's eyes when the crowd had stood up to him, the look of a man who had realized that his world was changing and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall. A storm was coming to Magnolia Plantation, and it would wash away more than just the dust from the day's violence. It would wash away the old order entirely. The storm that had been building for months finally broke on a night in late November, when the air was sharp with the promise of winter, and the moon hung like a silver coin in the star-scattered sky. Kwan had healed from his beating, though the scars would remain with him forever, not just on his back, but in the way the other enslaved people looked at him. There was something different in their eyes now, a mixture of awe and hope that he found both inspiring and terrifying. He had become more than just another worker. He had become a symbol. The change was subtle, but undeniable. Conversations stopped when Hargrove approached, but they no longer died completely. Work continued at its steady pace, but there was an undercurrent of something new, a quiet defiance that the overseer could sense but couldn't quite grasp. Hargrove, for his part, had become increasingly erratic. The man who had once ruled through calculated cruelty now lashed out unpredictably, his anger seeming to build with each passing day. He had taken to drinking more heavily, and his pale eyes held a wild quality that spoke of a mind under tremendous strain. The breaking point came, as these things often do, over something seemingly insignificant. It was a Tuesday evening, and the workers were returning from the fields as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. Kwan was walking beside old Samuel, discussing plans for repairing a broken plough, when they heard the commotion from the direction of the quarters. A crowd had gathered around one of the cabins, and at its center stood Hargrove, swaying slightly on his feet, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in one hand, and his whip in the other. Before him cowered a young woman named Grace, barely 18, her arms wrapped protectively around a bundle that could only be a baby. "Where is he?" Hargrove's words were slurred, but his intent was crystal clear. "Where's the father of that bastard child?" Grace's voice was barely a whisper. "Please, Massa Hargrove, I can't—" "Can't what? Can't tell me which of my property has been rutting with you like animals?" Hargrove's laugh was ugly, dangerous. "That child represents stolen time, stolen energy. Someone's going to pay for it." Kwan felt his blood turn to ice as he realized what was happening. Grace had given birth 3 weeks ago to a beautiful baby girl, and now Hargrove was demanding to know the father's identity so he could punish him for the crime of creating new life. "It doesn't matter who the father is," Grace said, her voice growing stronger despite her fear. "The baby's here now. She's innocent." "Innocent?" Hargrove's voice rose to a near shriek. "Nothing on this plantation is innocent. Everything here belongs to me, including that squalling brat." He reached for the baby, and Grace instinctively pulled back, clutching her child closer to her chest. The movement seemed to enrage Hargrove beyond all reason. "Give me that child!" he roared, lunging forward. What happened next would be debated and retold for generations. Some said Grace tripped as she tried to back away. Others claimed Hargrove deliberately struck her. But the result was the same. Grace fell backward, and the baby flew from her arms. Time seemed to slow as the tiny bundle arced through the air. Kwan, standing 20 feet away, saw it all with crystalline clarity. The baby's small face, peaceful in sleep, completely unaware of the danger. Grace's scream of terror. Hargrove's drunken lunge forward. And then Kwan was moving. He had always been fast for a man his size, but this was something beyond mere physical speed. This was the velocity of absolute desperation, of a man who would not, could not, allow an innocent child to be harmed. He caught the baby just inches from the ground, his massive hands cradling the tiny form with infinite gentleness. For a moment, the world was perfectly still. The baby opened her eyes and looked up at him with the unfocused gaze of the very young, and Kwan felt something shift inside his chest. "Give me that child." Hargrove's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Now!" Kwan looked up from the baby's face to find the overseer standing directly in front of him, whip raised, eyes blazing with drunken fury. Around them, the crowd had gone completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would change everything. "No," Kwan said quietly. The word hung in the air like a physical thing, solid and immovable. Hargrove's face went through several shades of red before settling on a deep purple. "What did you say to me?" "I said no." Kwan's voice was calm, steady, but underneath it ran a current of something that made several people in the crowd take an involuntary step backward. "You're not taking this child." Hargrove's whip whistled through the air, aimed at Kwan's face. But this time, something was different. This time, Kwan was ready. His free hand shot up and caught the whip's leather thong just inches from his cheek. For a moment, the two men stood frozen in a tableau of resistance and authority, the baby sleeping peacefully between them. Then Kwan began to pull. Hargrove, caught off guard and unsteady from drink, stumbled forward. The whip handle slipped from his grasp, and he found himself face to face with a man whose eyes held no trace of submission, no hint of the fear that had kept him in power for so long. "You want to hurt someone?" Kwan's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the crowd. "Then hurt me, but you will not touch this child." What followed was not really a fight. It was more like a force of nature encountering an immovable object. Hargrove, drunk and enraged, threw wild punches that Kwan absorbed without flinching. The overseer pulled a knife from his belt, but Kwan's free hand closed around his wrist with crushing force, and the blade fell harmlessly to the ground. Through it all, Kwan never stopped protecting the baby. Even as Hargrove clawed at his face, even as the overseer's fingernails drew blood from his cheek, Kwan kept the child cradled safely against his chest. Finally, with a movement so swift it seemed almost casual, Kwan's hand closed around Hargrove's throat. The overseer's eyes went wide as he found himself lifted off the ground, his feet kicking uselessly in the air. 15 years, Kwan said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated pain and rage. 15 years I've watched you hurt people who couldn't fight back. 15 years I've stood by while you turned human beings into broken animals. Hargrove's face was turning blue, his hands clawing desperately at Kwan's iron grip. Around them, the crowd watched in stunned silence as the natural order of their world turned upside down. "But not tonight," Kwan continued. "Tonight you picked the wrong fight." For a moment, it seemed as though he might actually kill the overseer. The rage that had been building inside him for years was finally free, and it would have been so easy to simply squeeze until Hargrove's struggles stopped forever. But then the baby in his other arm made a small sound, not quite a cry, just a tiny murmur of contentment. And in that sound, Kwan heard something that cut through his anger like sunlight through storm clouds. He heard hope. With deliberate care, he set Hargrove down. The overseer collapsed to his knees, gasping and clutching his throat, his pale eyes wide with shock and terror. "Get up," Kwan said quietly. "Get up and walk away. And if you ever threaten a child again, I will finish what we started here tonight." Hargrove struggled to his feet, his legs shaking like a newborn colt's. For a moment he seemed about to say something, to reassert his authority through words if not through force. But then he looked into Kwan's eyes and saw something that made him think better of it. Without another word, The overseer turned and stumbled away into the darkness, leaving behind his whip, his knife, and any pretense of control over Magnolia Plantation. Kwan gently returned the baby to Grace's waiting arms, and as he did, he felt the weight of every eye in the crowd upon him. They were looking at him with a mixture of awe, fear, and something else, something that took him a moment to recognize. They were looking at him like a leader. What happens now? The question came from Sarah, the healer, but it was echoed in the faces of everyone present. Kwan looked around at the assembled faces, men, women, and children who had lived their entire lives under the boot of oppression, who had never dared to dream that things could be different. And in that moment, he realized that everything had changed. There would be no going back to the way things were. Hargrove would return with reinforcements, with dogs, with guns. The authorities would be called. The full weight of the system would come crashing down on them, unless they acted first. "Now," Kwan said, his voice carrying across the crowd like a bell, "we choose. We can wait here for them to come for us, or we can take our freedom while we still can." A murmur ran through the crowd, excited and terrified in equal measure. Freedom, the word that had lived in their hearts for so long, whispered in the darkness, but never spoken aloud. "But where would we go?" asked Thomas, the man who worked the cotton gin. "They'll hunt us down like animals." "Then we don't run," Kwan replied. "We fight, we take what's ours and we hold it. Against the whole world." Old Samuel's voice carried the weight of his years, the accumulated wisdom of a man who had seen too much violence. Kwan looked at the old man, this person who had shown him kindness when kindness was dangerous, who had suffered for no crime other than existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. "If necessary," he said simply, "but I don't think it will come to that. I think there are more people like us than people like them. And I think it's time they remembered that." As if summoned by his words, a new voice joined the conversation. It was young Marcus, the 14-year-old boy who had spoken up during Kwan's beating months earlier. "My cousin works on the Henderson Plantation 5 miles north," he said, his voice cracking with excitement. "He told me they've been talking about the same things we have, about freedom, about fighting back. And there's the Williams place to the east," added another voice, "and the Morrison farm beyond that." Slowly, a picture began to emerge. A network of plantations, all connected by family ties and shared suffering, all simmering with the same, barely contained desire for freedom. "It could work," Sarah said quietly. "If we moved fast, if we coordinated." "It will work," Kwan corrected her. "Because it has to. Because the alternative is to live the rest of our lives on our knees. And I won't do that anymore." He looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing his own determination reflected in their eyes. These people had followed him this far, had stood with him against Hargrove's tyranny. Now he was asking them to follow him into something far more dangerous. "I won't lie to you," he continued. "This won't be easy. Some of us might not survive, but our children will be free. Our grandchildren will never know the weight of chains." The baby in Grace's arms chose that moment to wake up, her tiny fist waving in the air as if reaching for something beyond her grasp. And in that gesture, Kwan saw the future, a future where children like her would never have to fear the Marcus Hargroves of the world. "So what do you say?" he asked the crowd. "Are you ready to break your chains?" The response was not a roar of approval, but something far more powerful, a quiet, steady murmur of agreement that seemed to come from the very soul of every person present. They were ready. They had been ready for years, waiting only for someone to show them the way. As the crowd began to disperse, making plans and preparations for what was to come, Kwan stood alone in the moonlight, feeling the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders like a mantle. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, they would either be free or dead. But they would never again be slaves. And somewhere in the darkness he could hear the distant rumble of thunder, as if the very heavens were preparing for the storm that was about to break. The night of November 28, 1858, would be remembered as the night the impossible became inevitable. Kwan stood at the edge of the cotton field, his massive frame silhouetted against the star-filled sky, watching as small groups of figures moved through the darkness like shadows given purpose. The plan they had crafted over the past week was ambitious beyond reason. A coordinated uprising across 5 plantations, timed to begin at the stroke of midnight. It should have been impossible. Enslaved people had no means of communication across plantations, no weapons, no military training. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an entire system designed to crush any hint of rebellion. But they had something their oppressors had forgotten to account for. They had nothing left to lose. "The Henderson plantation is ready," whispered Marcus, appearing at Kwan's side like a ghost. The boy had proven invaluable as a messenger, his youth allowing him to move between plantations without arousing suspicion. "My cousin says they've got 43 people ready to move." Kwan nodded, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "William's place?" 57. They found weapons in the overseer's house, hunting rifles and ammunition. "Morrison Farm?" 31, but they control the grain stores. If this goes on for more than a few days, we'll need food. The numbers were encouraging, but Kwan knew that numbers alone wouldn't win this fight. They needed something more. They needed to break not just their physical chains, but the mental ones that had kept them enslaved for so long. A soft footstep behind him announced Sarah's arrival. The healer had spent the evening moving through the quarters, tending to last-minute injuries and fears with equal skill. "How are they?" Kwan asked without turning around. "Scared," Sarah replied honestly, "but determined. Grace asked me to give you this." She pressed something small and warm into his hand. Looking down, Kwan saw a tiny wooden carving, a bird in flight, its wings spread wide. It was crude work, obviously carved with whatever tools Grace could find, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. "She said it's for luck," Sarah explained. "Said she wanted you to remember what we're fighting for." Kwan closed his fingers around the carving, feeling its rough edges against his palm. Freedom. Such a simple word, but it contained entire worlds of possibility. "It's time," he said quietly. The signal was simple. A single lantern, lit and extinguished 3 times from the bell tower of the plantation's small chapel. Across the darkness, similar signals would be flashing from 4 other plantations, coordinating the beginning of something that had never been attempted on this scale. As the lantern flashed its message into the night, Kwan felt a strange calm settle over him. All the planning, all the preparation, all the fear and hope and desperate courage, it all came down to this moment. "Remember," he said to the small group gathered around him, "we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for every person who ever died in chains and every child who might be born free." The first target was the overseer's house, where Hargrove slept off another night of heavy drinking. Kwan approached the building with 4 other men, their footsteps silent on the wooden porch. The door was unlocked. Who would dare rob from the overseer? Inside, they found Hargrove passed out at his kitchen table, an empty bottle beside him, and a half-written letter to the authorities about increasing insubordination among the slaves. Kwan read the letter by lamplight, his jaw tightening as he saw his own name mentioned several times. "Should we kill him?" asked Thomas, his voice barely a whisper. Kwan looked down at the man who had terrorized them for so long. In sleep, Hargrove looked smaller somehow, more pathetic than threatening. His pale face was slack with drink, and there was drool on his chin. "No," Kwan said finally. "We're not murderers. We're freedom fighters." Instead, They bound Hargrove securely and left him tied to his own chair, with a note pinned to his chest. The age of fear is over. The age of freedom has begun. The weapons cache was in a locked cabinet, but Kwan's blacksmith skills made short work of the lock. Inside they found 3 rifles, 2 pistols, and enough ammunition to arm a small army. More importantly, they found the keys to every set of shackles on the plantation. As they distributed the weapons and keys, word came from the other plantations. The Henderson place had taken their overseer without a fight. The man had simply surrendered when faced with 43 determined people. William's plantation had been more difficult, with their overseer barricading himself in the main house, but they had eventually smoked him out. Only Morrison Farm had encountered serious resistance. Their overseer had managed to get off several shots before being overwhelmed, and 2 people had been wounded. But the farm was secure, and the wounded were being tended to. By dawn, 5 plantations covering nearly 10,000 acres were under the control of their former slaves. It was unprecedented in American history, a coordinated uprising that had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. But Kwan knew the real test was yet to come. As the sun rose over Magnolia Plantation, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, he stood on the porch of the main house, Master Beauregard's mansion, and looked out over land that was now, for the first time in its history, truly free. The plantation owner himself was locked in his own wine cellar, unharmed but thoroughly humiliated. His wife and children had been sent away in their carriage with instructions to contact the authorities, but not to return. "Let them know what's happened here," Kwan had told Mrs. Beauregard as she climbed into the carriage, her face pale with shock. "Let them know that we're not going anywhere." Now, as the morning light revealed the full scope of what they had accomplished, people began to emerge from the quarters, but they weren't the same people who had gone to sleep the night before. These were free men and women, walking with their heads held high for the first time in their lives. Grace approached the main house, carrying her baby, the tiny wooden bird carving pinned to her dress like a badge of honor. Behind her came old Samuel, moving slowly but with dignity, his weathered face bright with wonder. "What now?" Sarah asked, echoing the question that was on everyone's mind. Kwan looked out over the assembled crowd, nearly 200 people who had chosen freedom over safety, hope over despair. They were looking to him for answers, for leadership, for a vision of what came next. "Now we build something new," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd like a bell. "We build a community based on freedom, on equality, on the idea that every person has the right to determine their own destiny." "But they'll come for us," someone called out. "The army, the militia, they won't let this stand." "You're right," Kwan acknowledged. "They will come. And when they do, we'll be ready. We have weapons, we have supplies, and we have something they don't understand. We have the absolute certainty that we're fighting for what's right." He paused, looking out over the faces before him. Some were young, some old, some were strong, some weak. But all of them shared the same expression, the look of people who had tasted freedom and would never willingly give it up. "I won't lie to you," he continued. "The road ahead will be difficult. There will be battles to fight, hardships to endure. Some of us may not survive to see the end of this journey." He pulled out the wooden bird carving Grace had given him, holding it up so everyone could see. "But our children will be free. Our grandchildren will never know the weight of chains. And someday, when they ask how freedom came to this place, they'll hear the story of the night we chose to break our chains rather than live another day in bondage." The cheer that rose from the crowd was unlike anything Kwan had ever heard. It wasn't just celebration, it was the sound of souls being reborn, of spirits that had been crushed for generations, finally finding their voice. As the crowd dispersed to begin the work of building their new community, Kwan remained on the porch, watching the sun climb higher into the sky. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from the other plantations. Not the smoke of destruction, but the smoke of cooking fires, of people preparing meals as free men and women for the first time in their lives. Sarah joined him on the porch, her healer's bag slung over her shoulder. "Do you really think we can make this work?" she asked quietly. Kwan was quiet for a long moment, thinking about everything that had brought them to this point. The beatings, the humiliation, the years of accumulated pain and rage, but also the moments of kindness, the quiet acts of resistance, the unbreakable bonds of community that had sustained them through the darkest times. "I think," he said finally, "that we don't have a choice. We've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. We're free now, and freedom is something you can't give back once you've truly tasted it." In the distance, a church bell began to ring, not the plantation bell that had called them to work for so many years, but the bell of the small chapel where they had gathered for secret meetings and whispered prayers. It was ringing now in celebration, its clear notes carrying across the countryside like a declaration of independence. As the sound washed over him, Kwan felt something he had never experienced before, the complete absence of fear. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. He was free. And 3 months later, when the federal troops finally arrived to restore order, they found something that no one had expected. They found a thriving community of free people who had transformed 5 plantations into a model of cooperative agriculture and shared governance. The soldiers had come expecting to find chaos, rebellion, and violence. Instead, they found schools where former slaves were learning to read and write. They found workshops where skilled craftsmen were producing goods for trade with neighboring communities. They found fields that were more productive than they had ever been under the old system. Most importantly, they found people who were willing to fight and die rather than return to slavery. The standoff lasted for weeks, with neither side willing to fire the first shot. Finally, it was resolved not through violence, but through negotiation. The federal government, facing the prospect of a costly and bloody war against people who had committed no crime other than claiming their freedom, chose a different path. The Magnolia community, as it came to be known, was granted provisional autonomy as an experiment in post-slavery agriculture. It would serve as a model for reconstruction policies throughout the South, proving that former slaves could not only survive as free people, but thrive. Kwan lived to see his grandchildren born free, to watch them grow up in a world where their worth was measured not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He lived to see the wooden bird that Grace had carved for him become the symbol of their community, carved into the sign that welcomed visitors to the place where freedom had been born from pain. And when he died, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, the entire community gathered to honor the man who had shown them that chains could be broken, that the impossible could become inevitable, and that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is simply refuse to be broken. His gravestone bore a simple inscription, Kwan. He turned pain into power and broke his chains. But his true monument was the community itself, and the generations of free people who would carry his legacy forward into a future he had made possible through sheer force of will and an unbreakable spirit. The strongest slave had become the freest man, and in doing so, he had shown the world that freedom is not something that can be given or taken away. It is something that lives in the human heart, waiting only for the courage to claim it. Years later, when historians would write about the Magnolia community and the man who founded it, they would struggle to separate fact from legend. Did Kwan really break iron chains with his bare hands? Did he truly withstand 15 lashes from a cat o' nine tails without crying out? Did a single night of coordinated rebellion really transform 5 plantations into a beacon of freedom? The truth, as it often is, was both simpler and more complex than the legends suggested. Kwan was not a superhuman figure. He was a man who discovered that the greatest strength comes not from the absence of pain, but from the refusal to let pain define you. The Magnolia community survived and thrived for over a century, becoming a symbol of what was possible when people chose freedom over fear, hope over despair. The wooden bird that Grace carved became its emblem, and visitors from around the world came to see the place where the impossible had become inevitable. But perhaps the most important legacy of that November night in 1858 was not the community itself, but the idea it represented, that no chain is stronger than the human spirit's desire for freedom, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply refuse to be broken. In a world that often seems designed to crush the spirit and break the will, the story of Kwan reminds us that true strength is not measured in muscle or might, but in the quiet determination to keep standing when everything around you is trying to knock you down. And in that truth, perhaps, lies the real power to break any chain that binds us. If this story of unbreakable human spirit moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of courage, resilience, and triumph over impossible odds. Share this story with someone who needs to remember their own strength today, because sometimes the most important chains we break are the ones we never realized we were wearing. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, remember, you are stronger than you know, and your spirit is unbreakable.